So if we look at the before and after, then I think we already shaped her quite nice. And at this time, we didn't even use the liquify or anything. So it's not even that we faked anything or, you know, we just gave her a little bit more definition, so to speak, just by applying certain shadow and highlight areas. And that's the same that any makeup artist could also do. So I think the changes are subtle, but there's definitely a little bit more definition in her body and also in her face. And then with this step, I only went in, like I said, where if I zoom in a little bit, I saw this shadow in her eye or in the corner here that was too extreme, so I just painted over a little bit. So that was like a 30-second fix. And yeah, you could just also do this. This time I didn't go through the frequency separation. I literally just picked a little bit of color up here and painted over, and then a little bit of cloning. So just to bring out, or this shadow area, just to lighten this a little bit. But in the next step, I also want to see which other possibilities would I have to really have her eyes even more sparkle and to bring a little bit more contrast back into the image. And so, as I said before, there are many different ways in Photoshop how you can achieve pretty much the same. However, I just want to show you a little bit tricks or maybe some tips how you can also not only bring in more contrast, but you can also already define the contrast maybe with the color. Or you can also have one that's really great if you want to see how would the image look in black and white. So for example, if we would just go through the most easy and most obvious version of adding any contrast, or in here you can go for brightness and contrast. That's obviously super easy. It's the same how we did it before in Adobe Camera Raw. You could just drag the slider up until you think, okay, the image has now a lot of contrast. And if you're still not happy with the brightness, then you could change this here also. The problem is that every time you add some kind of clarity or contrast, your overall image will obviously be a lot more vibrant in tones. And if you don't want that, you can go onto the vibrant adjustment here and then click this button, because now it will only affect the layer underneath. And then you can say, okay, I like the contrast, but I'm not really that happy that the color went all the way up as well. And then you could just reduce this down a little bit. And if we zoom out of the image and then maybe just group them, so we see that the effect obviously has like two layers to see what's really going on. And let me just bring this back here so it's not in the way. And if we go in before and after, you see there's this contrast. And now you can decide if you like this kind of contrast, but obviously you have now again a little bit more of this bleached out background. That's kind of up to you. So that's one possibility. And okay, we could just keep this maybe with a lower opacity and say this is our brightness and contrast. So that was the first solution, obviously the most obvious one, because it says here actually brightness and contrast. So the other thing I sometimes like a lot, that's that you can give your images not only contrast, but you can also give it a certain color. And you can do this down here in the hue and saturation slider. And for that, you actually go on colorize, and now you have like a sepia picture if you like that. I think that's a little bit overdone, but I'm not actually using it just like that. So I want to warm it just a little bit. Normally around 30 and 40 or 35 is kind of an interesting effect. And now we want to go into soft light. And now we have some kind of contrast, but with a color effect also. Now you can decide which one you like better here. Here you had to go through first more contrast means more red, and then you had to desaturate it. Here you have the contrast because soft light as a blending mode already gives you a contrast look. However, we also colorized this, so that is also sometimes very interesting. And let me just reduce this down again so it's not too extreme. So now you have another way of contrast, and let's just call this color contrast. So we know what we did here. And again, it's just saying nee. Okay. And the other one that I also think can look very interesting is that you can also just change your sliders in your black and white adjustment here. So you can do the same thing. Either you can go up here and give it also a tint, or you can play here with your skin tones, for example. So this gives you the first indication how would the picture be in black and white, and then you could go in here and say again we want this maybe on a soft light, or you can always experiment obviously how does it look with an overlay, but most of the time it's a bit too extreme. And then it also gives you some kind of contrast, and this way it's a little bit better because you actually can play with the reds, for example, because we said the skin tone is mostly made with reds and yellows, and obviously you could now say maybe this is kind of interesting, yeah, if we have like a really bright red, and then you can also see if the yellow's doing more, and then yeah, you get a very stylized image. That might be also an option. Yeah, let's just reduce this down again, maybe just keeping this effect a little bit, and let's just call this black and white contrast so that I can just show you all these different ideas of contrast. And yeah, I don't want to rasterize it, I only want to name it. Okay, so that might be an option as well. Then what I also like, I don't know how it's about you, some people don't like these preset film things that Photoshop gives you, because before you couldn't really adjust any video, or you couldn't really do anything with video in Photoshop. But I think since CS6, I believe you can also edit video in some extension if you don't use Final Cut or the Adobe Premiere or whatever the other program is where you can cut video. But you can do some things in Photoshop, and for that Photoshop gives you actually these color lookups, and for me I sometimes quite like it if I go into crisp and warm, and then that gives me also this kind of warmish color and quite a contrasty look. I think with this it's far too yellow, it wouldn't really work. But if you imagine now maybe a model that's in a sunset or something like that, then this can also add an interesting saturated, slightly warmish and contrasty look. So sometimes that also works really well. Let's just add it here again with this kind of low opacity, just so that you see what's going on. And then let's call this color lookup contrast. And let's say, okay, I know. And then you can also play with more things. You have also here the hue and saturation in your color balance, where you can, similar to the dodge and burn, you have your midtones, your shadows and your highlights where you can give a color look to. So you can do a similar thing. You could bring the picture maybe now into more red or more yellow or more blue or whatsoever fits to your image. And again, you can change at any time your blending modes, and then again you get more contrast and a slightly colorized look. And again, I think this is here to yellow, but just to give you the idea. And then the other way, and that's one of my, I think it's probably the best version for me, how I add contrast, is with this one here, and that's the gradient map. So let me, before I use this, just bring them all together into one group already, and I call this, I don't know, like alternative contrast. And obviously there are many more ways. You could even go back into Adobe Camera Raw, you can add more clarity there, you can add obviously the contrast, you can use your black and your white slider, you can add more contrast in curves and levels with the black and the white slider. So there are so many ways, but sometimes I just think it looks interesting if I can define the picture already with some interesting color on it, and then I definitely think all of these adjustments in different blending modes, they can look really interesting. But for now I just want to toggle this off, so that's the before and after with all the different low opacity blending modes that we just did. And I quite like this gradient map. It might not work 100% on this image because it's very soft, but I will show you later how the effect is on a more dramatic image. And we want to use we click into this area here, And then I want to have it as a black and white image. And I often use this just to see even does this picture work in black and white. And you can see now also the difference if we just say here, okay, we keep it just as a black and white for now and toggle this off, and then we go back into our black and white, and you can see now the quality difference in the black and white in this adjustment and the gradient black and white. So if I go here, you have just a lot more contrast already by default, and here it's just a lot more like the 18% gray. It's more like a gray image, and here I think it's more a black and white image. And of course you could always just have here your black and white image, and then if you want then more contrast, you could bring in the curves layer, and you can do this typical S curve, for example, and then really darken down the shadows and brighten the lighter areas, so to speak. So that also can give you a lot of contrast. But for me, I often don't actually use the black and white for a black and white image, although you have these sliders, that's already quite helpful. But I normally quite like the gradient map because it just gives me this little bit more of a kick. And whenever I want to have this as more contrast, then I see already, would this work as a black and white? And maybe then later I will also transform it into a black and white. But for now, I do the same thing again. I just go into my soft light, and then I get this kind of contrast look, but then it's not too red, or I don't have to fix anything, I think, in itself. It just gives me a nice, slightly warmish color, brownish skin tone, and just gives me this really interesting stylized image. And then I can always go back and say maybe it's too extreme on like 100% opacity, so I lower it down. And then sometimes what can also look very interesting is that you bring in the gradient map one more time by clicking in here, going down to your black and white, say okay. And you could also do now things again, nearly like the dodge and burn if I go into soft light. And this time I leave it at the 100%, but I just want to invert my mask, and I just press Command and I. And now I can paint the effect in where I think that it would look also interesting to add just this little bit more contrast. So I'm here again with my brush, and then I switch my X so I have a white foreground color. And then I think maybe in the eyes it would be cool with just like a 50%. And then I can paint this in. And anywhere where I saw it before, there's this nice little contrast, like maybe on her nose, on her lips, maybe even more on the cheek, and then I can just really paint it in. I think on the hair it was quite nice, like a 3-dimension. And then if you have any other items like jewelry or anywhere where you think there it could be a little bit more contrasty, then you can paint on this as well. So let me see the before and after. So yeah, now we defined her face even more. And maybe it's even a little too extreme on her nose again, but as usually with the mask, you can just switch your X to a black foreground color and say maybe I went overboard on the nose, and I just paint this back. So that's no problem, and as usually you can reduce your opacity as well. But I think this can actually add this nice little sparkle in her eye again. And then if you think now the eyes are too dark, you could just do the same thing again with the dodge and burn that you did before. You can go into here, and I can just do this quickly on its own image layer and say, okay, maybe now I want this highlight even more. So let's go in the dodge tool, and then we just go maybe in the highlights, and then we really paint this out, and now her eyes sparkle like crazy. So I think that is also very interesting with the combination of the gradient map and then the sparkle in the eye with the dodge and burn. That definitely adds to an interesting image.